they vanished. No trace, no reason. And for 28 years, silence lay thick over the mesas and frozen lakes of northern Arizona. But when the ice began to melt one strange winter morning in 2015, it started whispering again. The names that had once haunted an entire community: Elijah and Maya Yazzie. Twin Mesa Lake was a place most people forgot existed. A man-made reservoir built in the 70s to cool a nearby mining site. It had since become a sheet of frozen stillness, a white wound stitched into red desert. That morning, a rancher named Carl Morton was riding across the lake's edge when his horse shied. There, glinting beneath the thinnest patch of melting ice, something metallic gleamed, curved, dulled, but too deliberate to be stone. He crouched, brushed snow away, and saw the faint curve of a blade. It took him a long time to realize it was a helicopter rotor. His breath steamed out in shock. And under that breath, one name slipped without meaning to: Elijah. For years, people in the Four Corners region spoke of the Yazzies like ghosts. Elijah Yazzie, 32 when he disappeared in 1987, was a firebrand, a Navajo activist who believed the mining companies cutting into the sacred red earth were poisoning not just land, but memory. He was the kind of man who would stand in front of bulldozers with nothing but a sign that read, "This land remembers." His wife, Maya, 29, was a midwife, a quiet force of nature who moved between hogans and trailers, helping mothers bring life into a world already weighed down with loss. When she vanished, she had been 7 months pregnant. Her unborn child was to be named Atsidi Nez, meaning born of the wind. That wind never came home. The official story was simple: mechanical failure. A rented Bell 206 helicopter took off on a cloudy September morning. A storm rolled in from the east. Radio contact was lost. Search and rescue found nothing. Case closed. But in the Navajo Nation, stories don't close so easily. Some said the storm wasn't natural. Some said another helicopter was seen trailing behind theirs. And some whispered that Elijah had found proof, documents, photographs, that could ruin powerful men. When word spread in 2015 that a wreck had surfaced beneath the thawing lake, the reservation came alive again. Reporters descended with satellite trucks and microphones. But among the crowd that gathered on the snow-crusted shore, one man stood apart. He was older now, gray-haired and worn, his eyes sunken deep behind wind-burnt lines. His name was David Begay, Maya's brother. For 28 years he had been searching for an answer no one wanted found. Now, watching divers drill through the ice, he felt both dread and hope bleeding into the same breath. They worked all day, cutting through feet of frozen water until a cable was hooked beneath the metallic shape. When the crane lifted, the sound of cracking ice echoed like bones breaking. And then, through clouds of frost, the machine rose, mud-smeared, algae-coated, but unmistakably a helicopter. The yellow paint was barely visible under the rust. The registration number, N527BW, matched the Yazzie's aircraft. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then came the smell: metal, oil, and time. Inside the fuselage was silence. 2 seats, one empty, one not. The pilot's seat, empty, tilted forward, harness shredded. The passenger seat held the remnants of a body still strapped in, the belt cutting across brittle ribs. A long braid of hair clung to the headrest, frozen into the fabric. And on one wrist, the faint shimmer of a turquoise bracelet, the kind passed down from mother to daughter. David staggered closer as investigators covered the wreck with tarps. "That's Maya," he whispered. "That's my sister." Later, the coroner's report confirmed what few could speak aloud. Within the decayed folds of the maternity dress were smaller bones, an unborn child's perfectly preserved within the skeleton of its mother. The media turned the discovery into spectacle. Vanished native couple found after 28 years. But in Shiprock, grief was not a headline, it was a river. And for David, it was a promise renewed. The camera footage from that day would later become infamous in documentaries. It showed David standing at the edge of the frozen lake, snow swirling around him, eyes locked on the half-sunken wreck. "If that's them," he said softly, "then maybe the truth froze with them too." To understand what that meant, you had to go back to the summer of 1987, before the silence began. Elijah Yazzie wasn't a man born into comfort. He grew up herding sheep for his grandmother, learning old songs that warned what happens when land is taken from those who speak to it. By his late 20s, he'd become a voice that couldn't be ignored. Part of the Sacred Earth Coalition, a small group of native environmental activists exposing illegal waste dumping by mining corporations operating under government contracts. His reports accused 3 companies of contaminating groundwater and carving pits into burial lands. One of those reports had just gone missing from his office the week before he vanished. Maya, his wife, had a gentler fire. She believed healing wasn't just medicine, it was protection. When her patients thanked her, she'd say, "We're all born from the same earth. We just have to remember not to poison her." She supported Elijah even when it scared her. And it did scare her. Their house phone had gone dead twice in 1 month. A pickup truck with tinted windows had idled outside their home for hours. A dead coyote had been left on their porch. Elijah laughed it off, but Maya started sleeping with the light on. When she told the local sheriff, he'd said, "Probably kids," or a stray dog. But she saw the way he avoided her eyes. 2 days before they vanished, Elijah told Maya he'd received new aerial photos from a contact in Gallup. They showed something strange. Burned trenches near the mining zone, lined with barrels that shouldn't have been there. "If we can get footage from above, that's proof," he said. "We can bring this to court." Maya begged him to wait until after the baby came. He smiled, said, "After the baby, there might not be land left to save." It was the only argument they didn't finish. The morning of September 12, 1987, was windless and cold. Elijah loaded the camera gear into the helicopter himself. The pilot who was supposed to fly them, Tom Sutter, called at the last minute saying he was too sick to make it. Elijah was licensed, so he decided to take the controls. Maya insisted on going with him. "You said this is the last flight," she told him. "Then we finish it together." She tied her hair, fastened her seatbelt around the swell of her belly, and whispered a prayer to the wind spirits. Auntie Jo, their neighbor, watched from her porch as the chopper lifted. She waved, Auntie Jo recalled years later, one hand on her belly, one on her heart. And then they were gone. At 10:47 a.m., the last radio transmission came through. Elijah's voice, steady but faint, said, "Storms rolling in." "We'll head east." The tower replied, "Copy that, 527 BW. After that, silence. Search teams combed over 100 miles. No debris, no signal. The company that owned the mine volunteered helicopters for the search. The irony was not lost on anyone. The official report concluded catastrophic weather failure, but there was no record of any storm that day. Weather data from the National Center showed clear skies until afternoon. That discrepancy was buried in the appendix of the report, unnoticed or ignored. Maya's brother David refused to stop. He sold his truck to print missing posters, drove to every county office, begged reporters to cover the case. Some listened, most didn't. One deputy told him, "You people always looking for ghosts." Years turned to decades. The files gathered dust in a basement cabinet labeled Unresolved, Probable Crash. The mining companies merged, changed names, erased history. Now, 28 winters later, the lake had given something back, but not pice. As the wreck was hauled from the ice, the tail boom caught the light. David noticed small round holes along the metal, perfectly circular, too clean for rock impact. The investigator dismissed them as corrosion. David stared at them long after sunset, the wind freezing tears to his face. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew what he was seeing. Those weren't cracks, they were bullet holes. That night, alone in his truck, David unfolded the last letter Maya had written him. The paper was soft with age, the ink smudged. "When this is over," she'd written, "promise me you'll plant that cedar we talked about. For protection, for the baby." He pressed the letter against the dashboard light, tracing her words. Then he whispered, "I will, Maya. But first, I'll find out what they did to you." Outside, the wind howled across the frozen lake, carrying with it a low hum that might have been memory, or the faint echo of rotors, still turning somewhere beneath the ice. When the wreck came up from the ice, it didn't just bring a helicopter. It brought back every silence that had ever been forced on the Yazzie family. In the days that followed, the shore of Twin Mesa Lake turned into a spectacle of flashing cameras, reporters shouting questions through muffled scarves, deputies pacing in mirrored sunglasses. The cold couldn't stop the noise. But under all that noise was one steady pulse: David Begay's quiet refusal to look away. He'd been through this before, back in 1987, when the same sheriff's department had promised a full and transparent investigation. He remembered how they'd searched for 2 weeks and declared it hopeless, how the mining company's spokesman had shaken his hand and said, "Sometimes the desert keeps what it takes." Now, nearly 3 decades later, that same company had a new name, new logo, and the same smiling spokesman standing before microphones saying how relieved they were that the family could finally have closure. Closure. The word made David's stomach turn. Closure was what you gave a story when you wanted people to stop asking questions. The investigators photographed everything: angles, bullet-like holes, serial numbers. But when David asked about the tail section, a deputy blocked his view and said, "This area's restricted pending federal review." Federal. That word always meant the truth was leaving the reservation again. By the next morning, the wreckage was gone, hauled away on 2 flatbed trucks headed east. The site was swept clean as if nothing had ever happened. Only the dark patch of ice remained, slowly refreezing. 3 nights later, David drove to the sheriff's office. He waited until the reporters had left, then asked to see the evidence logs. The clerk, a young deputy with tired eyes, told him the wreck was transferred to a state facility in Flagstaff. When David pressed for the report, the man hesitated, glancing around. "Sir," he whispered, "they told us to close it under code 214, accidental aviation death. That means we don't reopen. Who told you?" "The FAA rep." But the badge he used wasn't FAA. David nodded slowly. "You saw the holes in that tail?" The deputy swallowed. "Yes, sir." They looked drilled. "Bullets," David said. "Not wind, not ice. Bullets." Outside, snow drifted under the streetlights, thick and quiet. He stood there for a long time, hands buried in his coat, thinking of Maya's bracelet glinting under the tarp. She'd always said turquoise was protection. Maybe it had protected the truth, frozen it long enough to come back. Over the next weeks, media interest faded. The mining company donated $10,000 toward a memorial scholarship and released a statement praising Elijah's dedication to environmental awareness. It was a public relations masterpiece, and people moved on. But David couldn't. He started digging through archives again, old survey maps, weather records, flight logs. The more he read, the stranger it got. The air traffic control transcripts from that day were missing. Pages 42 to 49 in the original file were blank, replaced with a slip reading, "Page intentionally left blank." He found a memo dated 2 weeks after the disappearance, signed by Sheriff Clayton Redd. Close search operation. No credible evidence of foul play. Redd had retired the following year and moved into a private security job for the same mining conglomerate Elijah had been investigating. David drove out to Redd's property one morning in January. The old man was in his 70s now, living in a house paid for by the company pension. He answered the door in slippers, surprised but not alarmed. When David introduced himself, Redd's smile froze. "You're Maya's brother," he said. "Yes. I heard they finally found the helicopter." "I'm sorry for your loss." David studied his face. "You were the one who called off the search." Redd sighed. "Son, we searched that canyon a dozen times. The terrain out there eats machines. Nobody wanted to stop. You ever check Twin Mesa Lake?" "Wasn't in the flight path." David stepped closer. "It was on the mining company's land lease, wasn't it?" Redd didn't answer. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "Sometimes people just crash," he said finally. "You dig too deep, you end up buried too." Then he closed the door. Back in his truck, David stared at the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He wasn't afraid anymore, just tired of being lied to. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out the envelope he'd kept since 1987. The photos Elijah had given him days before the flight. Grainy, taken from the air, but clear enough to show dark trenches carved into red earth. Rows of half-buried barrels leaking something black into the sand. On the back of one photo, Elijah had written in pencil, "Site C, north of Twin Mesa." David hadn't realized until now that the site sat less than 5 miles from the lake. He decided to go there. The dirt road to Site C was half buried in snow, the old warning signs rusted and unreadable. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain on steel. What used to be a mine pit was now a fenced-off basin filled with dirty water and ice. But behind the fence he found something else. A concrete pad, cracked and overgrown, the faint outline of an H still visible beneath the frost. A helipad. Someone had been landing aircraft here, maybe still was. He photographed everything, careful not to touch anything that could break. As he circled the pad, his boot struck something small and hard. He bent down. It was a fragment of metal, no bigger than his palm, painted yellow, the same faded shade as the Yazzie's helicopter. The edge was jagged, torn by heat. He pocketed it and drove home through the dark. That night, he called a friend from the old days, Marjorie Klein, an investigative journalist who'd covered native rights in the 80s. She answered on the second ring. "David? I thought you'd stopped chasing ghosts." "They found the helicopter," he said. Silence. "Then where?" "Twin Mesa Lake. Maya was inside. Elijah wasn't, oh God." "I think it was shot down." He could hear her scribbling notes. "Send me what you have." "I'll see what I can dig up on the mining permits." "Be careful," he said. "They still have friends in every office." She laughed softly. "Then it'll feel like old times." Over the next month, Marjorie sent him documents. Flight manifests, contractor rosters, maintenance logs. Buried in the fine print of a 1987 insurance claim, she found a line item for aerial equipment damage, secondary unit. The claim was filed by a subcontractor that didn't officially exist, Red Rock Logistics. David traced it to a P.O. box registered to the same address once used by the Sheriff's Auxiliary Fund. He didn't need a lawyer to tell him what that meant. Someone had been running side flights, unregistered, off the books, using the company's helicopters. Elijah must have caught them on camera. Meanwhile, rumors spread. People who'd worked at the mine started calling David at night, voices shaking. One man said he'd seen a second helicopter take off the morning Elijah disappeared. Black, no tail number. Another said he'd been ordered to drain fuel drums into the river that week, for maintenance. Each story contradicted the official record, yet they all pointed to the same truth. Elijah hadn't fallen from the sky. He'd been erased. By March 2015, David had a folder thick with evidence, but nowhere to take it. The tribal police couldn't reopen a case declared federal. The FBI ignored his emails. The county said the wreck was in analysis. So he went back to the lake. The snow had melted into muddy slush, the water dark and restless. He stood where the helicopter had been pulled out and threw a handful of cedar leaves into the current, the ones he'd promised Maya he'd plant. "Guide me," he whispered. The wind answered with nothing but cold. 2 days later, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a small flash drive and a note written in block letters. "You're looking in the right place. Listen before they erase it again." He plugged it into his laptop. The file was audio, distorted, but the voices were unmistakable. A radio transmission, time-stamped September 12, 1987. Elijah's voice, calm but strained. "Storms rolling in. We'll head east." Then another voice, faint and unfamiliar. "Copy. 527 BW. Maintain course. Don't descend." A pause. Rotor noise. Then Elijah again, sharper. "We've got another aircraft on our tail." "They're not responding." Static swallowed the rest. David replayed it until dawn. The next morning, he called Marjorie. "I have proof now," he said. "They chased him." "Where did you get it?" "I don't know. But whoever sent it wants the truth out." Marjorie exhaled. "Then we tell it." What neither of them knew was that by reopening the story, they'd also reopened the wound the town had worked decades to bury. Within a week, David's house was broken into. His files were scattered, his computer gone. Nothing else was stolen. On his doorstep, a single piece of paper fluttered under the wind. It was an old photograph of Elijah standing beside his helicopter, smiling. Across the image, someone had written in red marker, "Let it rest." David burned the photo that night, not out of fear, but out of rage. The ashes drifted out the window and vanished into the snow. He looked toward the horizon, where the mine lights glowed faintly in the dark, and whispered, "Not yet, brother. Not yet." By spring 2015, the red mesas had begun to thaw, and with them, the truth started to breathe again. The snow was gone from Twin Mesa Lake, but the outline of the helicopter's rescue remained etched in the mud, like a wound that refused to close. David Begay drove there almost every week, parking at the same place where the crane had lifted Maya's remains. Sometimes he just sat in silence, engine off, listening to the wind slide across the water. It was the same sound he'd grown up with, the same voice of the land that had once carried laughter, drums, prayers, and now only questions. The break-in at his house had shaken him, but not stopped him. He replaced the door with steel, moved what little evidence he still had into a storage locker under a false name, and started using burner phones to talk to Marjorie Klein. She'd become his only ally now. Every night they spoke, piecing together fragments from 30 years of vanished records. Her voice, still steady after decades of chasing corruption, was both anchor and warning. "If they broke in," she said, "it means you're close." Marjorie had found something strange in state archives. A maintenance invoice from September 1987 billed to Red Rock Logistics, the same ghost company linked to the Sheriff's Auxiliary Fund. The invoice listed rotor maintenance for 2 helicopters, not one. Both had been serviced at a private hangar just outside Farmington the week before the Yazzies vanished. The first matched Elijah's rental craft. The second, labeled only Unit 9, had no serial number, but the mechanic's signature, T. Sutter, was clear. Tom Sutter? The pilot who'd canceled that morning claiming he was too sick to fly. David stared at the scan Marjorie emailed him. "You think he was flying that second helicopter?" "I think he was paid to," she said. "And if he's alive, someone made sure he stayed quiet." Tom Sutter had vanished from official records in 1990. No obituary, no forwarding address, nothing. But pilots leave trails. License renewals, medical clearances, fuel purchases. Marjorie traced one old renewal to a flight school in Colorado Springs. David made the 6-hour drive the next day. The instructor there, an old man named Harris, remembered Sutter instantly. Quiet fella. Flew cargo runs for a while, then he just quit. Sold his gear, said he was heading north. Why? "Did he ever talk about the Navajo crash in '87? David asked. Harris blinked. "That old thing?" "Yeah." Said it still kept him up at night. "Wouldn't say why. Where'd he go after he quit?" "Alaska, I think." Said he had a job flying supplies for some exploration outfit. David thanked him and left. Outside, the wind smelled of jet fuel and snowmelt. Alaska felt like another planet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Sutter had been running from something that still knew how to find him. Back home, Marjorie called with her own news. She'd tracked down a retired FAA technician who'd worked in Flagstaff during the '80s. He remembered an unusual request that year: to erase a flight path from the federal database because of instrument error. The request came from a man named Gerald Macklin, listed as a consultant for Red Rock Logistics. Macklin, it turned out, later became a regional safety officer for the same mining conglomerate Elijah had accused. They cleaned their own mess, she said. Officially. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. If they wiped the flight path, how did the helicopter end up over that lake? Marjorie hesitated. Unless that's where they wanted it to end up. For days, David replayed the audio file. The faint hum of rotors, Elijah's voice reporting a storm, the static, the other aircraft. Each time he listened, he heard something new, a pop of interference, a metallic crack right before the transmission cut out. He sent it to a sound engineer he knew from a community radio station. 2 days later, the man called back. "That's not interference," he said. "That's gunfire. 3 rounds, close range. Maybe more." David felt the room tilt around him. Gunfire. Confirmation of what he'd suspected, since he saw those holes in the tail. Someone had shot them down. But why? To silence one man? To protect a company? To erase a truth that had already bled into the dirt? He drove to the reservation archives in Window Rock, searching for anything Elijah had filed before his death. Among boxes of fading papers, he found a thin folder stamped Environmental Survey, Confidential. Inside were photocopies of water testing results dated August 1987. The readings showed uranium traces in a well used by 2 nearby communities, levels 30 times the legal limit. Attached was a handwritten note from Elijah. "Need aerial proof before release." And below that, in Maya's handwriting, a single line: "Be safe, come home to us." He sat there until closing, fingers trembling against the paper. Proof. They had proof. And that's why they died. It was that simple and that cruel. That night, as he packed the folder into a safe, headlights flashed outside his window. A car idled at the end of his driveway for almost a minute, then drove off slowly. He didn't follow. He just watched, memorizing the sound of the engine. A diesel rumble, heavier than a sedan, lighter than a truck. He started keeping a shotgun by the door after that. 2 weeks later, Marjorie called again. "I found someone from the mine," she said. "He won't talk on record, but he wants to meet. Says he worked maintenance on aerial runs. Where? Page, tomorrow night. A bar by the dam. I'll be there." The man's name was Leonard Price. He looked like someone who'd spent too many nights not sleeping, thin, hands shaking as he stirred his drink. "I can't say much," he whispered. "Back then, I worked nights refueling choppers. 2 birds went up that morning, one yellow, one black. We were told to log only the yellow one." "Who told you?" "Sheriff's man." Red David's stomach tightened. "You sure?" Bryce nodded. "I saw him hand a folder to the pilot of the black one. Big guy, shaved head. Not your brother-in-law. What happened after the crash?" 2 days later, they shut the site down. We were told to forget it. A week after that, one of our mechanics died in a car accident. Only it wasn't his car. He slid a small photograph across the table. Blurry, nighttime, but unmistakable. 2 helicopters side by side on a concrete pad, one painted yellow, the other matte black. "I took that the night before they went up," Price said. "I was drunk, but not blind." David stared at it, the air leaving his lungs. Proof. When he looked up again, Price was gone. The bar door swung slowly shut, and through the window David saw a pickup truck pulling away fast. By the time he reached the parking lot, its taillights were already disappearing down the road. He mailed the photo to Marjorie that night along with a note. "If I disappear, tell the world they used 2 helicopters." Then he hid copies of the documents in 3 different places. One at his sister's old house, one under the cedar tree he'd planted for her, and one at the tribal community center. He didn't know who to trust anymore, but he knew the truth had to outlive him. Marjorie kept pushing on her end. She called old contacts in the Bureau of Land Management, requested declassified survey maps, and found something chilling. The area around Twin Mesa Lake had been marked as a temporary restricted air zone on the exact day of the disappearance, September 12, 1987. The order was signed not by the FAA, but by a Department of Energy liaison. "They closed the sky before the crash even happened," she told David. "Someone planned this." That night, David dreamed of his sister. She was standing by the lake, her braid frozen stiff, the turquoise bracelet catching moonlight. In her arms, the faint shimmer of a child. She didn't speak, she just pointed behind him, toward the mountains where the mine still glowed faintly orange in the dark. He woke, with tears frozen on his face. At sunrise, he packed his truck again, camera, notebook, pistol, and a thermos of coffee, and drove back to Site C. The wind had carved the snow into ripples, like sand in a desert of white. As he stepped through the broken fence, a raven lifted from the helipad and circled above him, croaking once before flying east. He followed its path with his eyes and froze. Half buried in the ice near the old drainage ditch was something shiny. He knelt, scraped with his gloves, and uncovered a metal box about the size of a lunch pail, corroded but intact. A tag was welded to its side. Flight recorder, do not tamper. The black box. He stared at it for a long time, his breath fogging the metal. Somewhere behind him, the wind shifted and carried a sound, distant, mechanical, like an engine starting far away. He turned, heart hammering, but saw only the empty plane. Carefully, he wrapped the recorder in his coat and hurried back to his truck. The snow had started falling again, thick, fast, as if the sky itself was trying to hide what he'd found. On the drive home, he called Marjorie. "I've got it," he said. "Got what?" "The black box." From their helicopter. She was silent for a full 5 seconds. Then, softly, "David, don't take it home. Bring it to me. We'll open it together." He glanced in the rearview mirror. Headlights flickered far behind him, too steady to be coincidence. He pressed the accelerator, the tires biting into slush, the recorder heavy on the seat beside him. Somewhere, in that metal box, was the sound of the last seconds of his sister's life, the truth that had been frozen, hidden, and stolen. Now it was awake again, and someone out there knew it. The snow thickened into a white curtain as David drove down the mountain road, headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the dark. The black box sat on the seat beside him, wrapped in his coat, still cold from the ground. Every time the truck hit a bump, it gave a hollow clank, like something alive inside wanted to speak. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The pair of headlights behind him never faded, never grew closer, just hovered at the same distance, steady, patient. He pressed harder on the gas, the tires fishtailing slightly on the slick asphalt. The recorder slid and thudded against the door. He reached the junction where the main highway met the dirt access road and killed his headlights. The truck idled in darkness. Through the snow, he watched the lights behind him crawl closer, too slow for a regular car, too deliberate. When they reached the junction, the vehicle paused, its own lights dimming, as if searching. Then it turned the other way, heading toward the highway. Only when the taillights vanished did David breathe again. He drove on through the storm, every nerve stretched thin. He reached Marjorie's small rented house in Gallup just before midnight. Her porch light flicked on as he pulled up, and she stepped out in a coat, hair tied back, a cigarette glowing between her fingers. "You look like hell," she said. "Feels about right." He held up the coat bundle. It was buried under ice near the old drainage ditch. "I think it's real." She stubbed out the cigarette, ushered him inside. The living room was a mess of files, photographs, and old cassette decks. On the table sat a portable reader she'd borrowed from a friend at a news station. Let's see what 30 years of silence sounds like. They worked in near darkness, the hum of the old refrigerator the only sound, as Marjorie pried open the recorder's casing. Inside, the reel was still intact, sealed in protective tape. She handled it like an artifact. If this is genuine, the magnetic coating might still hold something. They threaded it carefully into the reader, powered it up, and pressed play. At first, there was nothing, just the hiss of dead air. Then, faintly, the sound of rotor blades, a rhythmic pulse of mechanical heartbeat. A man's voice came through, warped by time. Elijah's. Visibility dropping, heading east at 2000. Then another voice, the same one from the earlier recording David had received. Unidentified, calm, official. "Copy that, 527BW, maintain altitude." Static, the rumble of wind. Then something sharp, 3 pops, close together. Gunfire. Elijah's voice again, panicked now. "We're hit! Maya, tell them!" The sentence cut off in a shriek of metal. Then another voice. Lower, closer to the microphone, not Elijah's. "Target down. Repeat, target down. Site C secured." The tape ended in a long screech before the reel slowed to silence. David stared at the machine, frozen. His hands trembled so badly he couldn't reach the stop button. Marjorie did it for him, pressing her palm over his. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "They shot them down." He nodded slowly. "And recorded it like procedure." She leaned back, pale. That voice at the end, Site C secured. That's military jargon. This wasn't some drunk deputy. This was coordinated. David swallowed hard. Then we have proof. Real proof. They copied the file onto multiple drives, labeling each one differently. Marjorie sealed the original reel back in its casing. "We'll keep one copy off-site," she said. "I know a reporter in Phoenix who still owes me a favor. If we can verify this with audio analysis, it'll make national." David glanced toward the window. Snow still fell, soft and thick, muting the world outside. "Then we need to move fast." They didn't sleep that night. By dawn, the storm had stopped, leaving a sky washed pale and empty. Marjorie brewed coffee as David stood at the window, watching tire tracks half filled with snow. "Someone followed me here," he said quietly. She didn't turn. "I'm not surprised. I started getting hang-up calls after we talked about Red Rock last week. Same number. Always one ring, then nothing. Think they're tapping? Always assume yes." She set the cup beside him. "Drink. You'll need it by noon." They drove into town to make copies of the tape. Marjorie insisted on using 3 different print shops, transferring the audio to CDs and digital files under unrelated names. When they came out of the last store, a white SUV idled across the street. David noticed the antenna first. Too long for a civilian car. The driver was watching them over the rim of a newspaper. As they walked to their truck, the SUV pulled away, slow but unmistakably trailing, until they merged with traffic. They drove in silence for 10 minutes before Marjorie said, "We're being followed again." "I see it. Turn left." He did, cutting through back streets until they reached a crowded marketplace. They parked between 2 delivery vans and waited. The SUV rolled past once, twice, then vanished. Back at her house, they packed essentials. Marjorie locked her files in a trunk, slid the black box into her backpack. "If we split up, they can't take it all," she said. "You go north, I'll head to Phoenix with the digital copies." David hesitated. "They'll come for you." "They already are. But I've been running stories like this my whole life. You just keep your sister's name alive." They parted at the crossroads near Grant's. He watched her car shrink in the rear view until the road swallowed her completely. He didn't know it then, but it would be the last time he saw her alive. 2 days later, her rental car was found at the edge of the interstate outside Holbrook. Engine running, door open, no sign of struggle. The black box was gone. The only thing left was her press badge lying in the passenger seat, cracked down the middle. The news called it an unexplained disappearance. To David, it was a message. He drove through the night, every mile heavier than the last. He stopped at a motel outside Flagstaff, checked in under a fake name, and turned on the local news. The headline flashed across the screen. "Veteran journalist missing, last seen. Investigating 1987 Navajo helicopter case." The reporter's voice was cold, efficient, detached. There was no mention of the tape, no mention of what she'd found. Just another missing woman. Another silence. David switched off the TV. His chest felt hollow, the edges of grief sharp as broken glass. He took out the last remaining drive, the one he'd hidden in his jacket before they split up. It was all he had left of their work. He copied it again, uploaded fragments to an encrypted server he'd learned about from an activist friend. Then he sat on the bed, staring at the snow beyond the window, and whispered, "You're not taking this too." But they were already trying. The next morning, his motel door was ajar. Nothing missing but his wallet and the folder of aerial photos. On the bathroom mirror, written in condensation, were 3 words, "Let them rest." He packed again, driving south toward the reservation. He needed allies, people who remembered Elijah, people who still cared. He went first to the Sacred Earth Coalition's old office, a converted trailer on tribal land. Inside, dust lay thick on everything, but on one wall hung a photograph of the 1987 protest. Elijah with his arm around Maya, both smiling, their unborn child already visible in her belly. Beneath it, scrawled in marker, were Elijah's words, "This land remembers." David traced the letters with his fingers. "So will I," he said softly. He began reaching out to the old members, one by one. Some had moved, some had died. One, an elderly activist named Louise Tenorio, still lived near Window Rock. She welcomed him with open arms and tears in her eyes. "You found her," she said, holding his hands. "I found what they did to her." She nodded, eyes shining. "We always knew it wasn't the storm. Elijah told me the week before. He said if something happens, tell them to look to the sky, not the earth." "What did he mean?" Louise led him to a box in her closet. Inside was a cassette tape labeled July 1987, meeting notes. They played it on an old player. Elijah's voice filled the small room, steady and defiant. "If they try to stop us, they'll do it from above. They'll call it weather or malfunction, but it'll be bullets and fire. And if they kill us, promise me you'll tell everyone what they did to the water." Louise wiped her eyes. He knew. He saw it coming. David sat in silence, the weight of it all pressing on him. He had his sister's death on tape, her husband's warning on record, and a government that would erase both without blinking. "They can't bury this forever," he said. Louise placed her hand over his. "Then make sure they don't. But be careful, son. Ghosts aren't the only ones who follow the living." That night, as he drove back through the desert, the horizon flared with lightning, though the sky was clear. Far ahead, a faint glow shimmered above the mountains. The mining site, still active, still humming. He pulled over and stepped out into the cold air. The wind was sharp with the smell of metal and rain. Somewhere in the distance, a low hum rose and faded again, like rotors turning against the night. He looked toward the glow and whispered, "I'm coming." The desert at night is never truly silent. It hums with things unseen, power lines trembling, wind sliding over canyons, coyotes calling from the ridges. But as David drove back toward Twin Mesa, the sound that filled his ears wasn't the hum of the earth. It was the faint phantom echo of rotors. He kept glancing upward, though there was nothing but a blank, starless sky. His headlights carved the road into a pale river of dust and snow, and behind him the horizon glowed faintly orange, the mining site still burning through the dark like an open wound that refused to heal. He stopped near the same cedar tree he'd planted for Maya, the one he'd promised to grow for her unborn child. Its thin trunk bent under the wind, roots half frozen, but still alive. He brushed the snow from its base, pressed his palm against the bark, and whispered, "I'm still here." Then he opened the tailgate, spreading out the fragments of what he'd gathered, the copied drive of the flight recorder, the cassette from Louise, a handful of photographs. They looked pitifully small under the truck's dome light, but they were enough to damn an empire if he could make someone listen. The problem was, no one wanted to. Every agency he reached out to, state, federal, even the tribal council, gave the same response. "We'll review your evidence." Then silence. Within days, calls stopped going through. Email attachments bounced back with messages like undeliverable content. The walls were tightening. He thought about going public himself, posting everything online, naming names. But he knew what happened to people who did that. Marjorie was proof. She had been a professional, visible, connected, and still they'd made her vanish between one highway and the next. He was a mechanic with no protection, no power, Yet the thought of doing nothing was worse. It felt like burying Maya again. 3 nights later, he received a message on an encrypted form he'd used once before, years ago, to coordinate protest logistics. The sender's name was only Raven Eye. The message read, "We know what you have. Meet at the water tower north of Burnt Ridge. Midnight. Come alone." It could have been a trap. It probably was. But something in him, the part that had already lost everything, didn't care anymore. He printed a single copy of the audio waveform from the black box and tucked it into his jacket pocket, just enough to prove what he carried. Then he loaded his revolver and drove. The water tower stood in the middle of nowhere, an old rusted skeleton silhouetted against a half moon. The ground was crusted with frost. He parked with his headlights off and waited. The wind was sharp enough to sting. For a long time there was nothing but the sound of metal groaning in the cold. Then, from the shadows near the tower's base, a figure stepped out. A woman. "David Begay?" He nodded slowly, hand near his jacket. She raised both palms. "Name's Lena. I used to work for the mining company, Environmental Assessment Division." He studied her face, late 30s, tired eyes, windburned skin. If this is another setup, it's not. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folded document. "They'll kill me for this, so listen fast." The papers were internal memos, aerial inspection schedules, flight authorizations, and a line item that made his stomach twist. Operation Clearing, September 12, 1987. 2 aircraft authorized. Objective: neutralize threat. Maintain containment. He flipped through the pages. The signatures were blurred, but legible enough to make out one name, G. Macklin, the same consultant Marjorie had linked to Red Rock Logistics. "They called it Operation Clearing," Lena said quietly. "Elijah found evidence of illegal dumping in the Red Ridge Basin. They needed him gone before he handed it to the press." The second helicopter wasn't a coincidence. David stared at the pages until his vision blurred. "You're saying they ordered the hit?" She nodded. "And the sheriff's office helped stage the storm story. They were all paid through a development grant fund. I handled the environmental audits. I saw the transfers he wanted to ask more, but headlights swept across the horizon, 2 vehicles coming fast." Lena's eyes widened. "They found us," she hissed. She stuffed the papers into his coat. "Go. Get to the canyon road. There's an old service tunnel that cuts through the ridge. They won't know it." "What about you?" She smiled, small and sad. "I stopped running years ago." Then she turned and walked into the dark. David ran to his truck, heart pounding. The vehicles crested the hill behind him, their lights high and white, SUVS unmarked. Bullets tore through the air as he started the engine, glass shattering across his face. He floored it, tires spitting gravel. The headlights behind him multiplied, 3, 4, maybe more. He hit the dirt track Lena had mentioned, bouncing over rocks, the steering wheel jerking like a live thing in his hands. The path narrowed between ridges, the sound of engines echoing off stone. Ahead, he saw the tunnel, a rough bore through the mountain, once used for drainage. He killed his lights and plunged in. Inside, darkness swallowed everything. He drove by memory, scraping the truck's mirrors against the walls until daylight glimmered faintly on the far side. When he burst out into open air, he didn't stop. He drove another 10 miles before pulling over near an abandoned rest stop, chest heaving. Behind him, no headlights followed. Only the night, heavy and endless. He sat there for a long time, breathing in the scent of oil and gunpowder. When he finally looked at the papers again, his hands were trembling. The memos were dated the day before Elijah's flight, signed by 3 people: Macklin, Red, and a third name he didn't recognize, C. Holbrook. He would learn later that Holbrook was a regional director for the mining company's security division, a man with military background who'd vanished from corporate rosters the same month Marjorie disappeared. By morning, David drove back to the reservation. He went straight to the tribal radio station, one of the few places still locally controlled, and asked to speak live on air. The host, a young woman named Inez, had grown up hearing stories about the Yazzies. When she saw the documents and heard the recording, she went pale. "If we air this, they've buried us long enough," he said. "Let them hear what really happened." That evening, the broadcast went live. Inez's voice, steady and soft, introduced the segment. "Tonight we bring you evidence long hidden, the truth behind the disappearance of Elijah and Maya Yazzie." Then came the tape. Rotor sounds, gunfire, Elijah's voice cut short, and that cold official tone declaring, "Site C secured." The sound filled every kitchen, every truck cab, every small home that still tuned to the tribal station. The phone lines lit up. Some cried, some cursed, others sat in stunned silence, but within an hour the signal was cut. Dead air. Inez looked up from the console, confusion turning to fear. "They shut us down," she whispered. Outside, a black SUV idled by the fence, its engine humming. David grabbed the drive and ran out the back door, disappearing into the dark before the agents reached the building. He spent the next 3 days sleeping in his truck, moving constantly, eating from gas station shelves. Each night he replayed the tape on a small player, reminding himself why he couldn't stop. The sound of his sister's voice didn't exist, but he could still feel her there, wrapped in the silence between the noise. Sometimes he spoke to her. "I'm still here, Maya. I won't let them erase you." By the 4th day, word had spread beyond the reservation. Independent bloggers picked up fragments of the story, quoting unnamed sources. Old activists came forward with letters, maps, rumors. A movement was waking, slow but unstoppable. Yet David knew movements didn't scare corporations. Proof did. And he still needed one more thing: the missing half of the black box data. When Marjorie's recorder had been stolen, it had contained 2 reels. Only one was recovered. The other was gone. He went back to the lake one last time, drawn by instinct. The ice was melting again under the late spring sun, the surface broken into mirrors. He waded into the shallows where the helicopter had been lifted months before, feet numb in the cold water. Something about the area felt wrong. Too clean. Divers had scoured it before, but the sediment patterns didn't match what he remembered. He walked another few feet and saw it, a piece of cable half buried in mud, leading toward the deeper part of the lake. He followed it, pulling gently until something heavy shifted below. With a grunt, he dragged up a small sealed case, military grade, marked with faded letters, property of Red Rock Logistics. He took it back to his truck, pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside was another reel, twin to the one he'd already played. His breath caught. This was it, the missing half. The recording might hold the rest of Elijah's final transmission, maybe even the names of those on the second helicopter. He wrapped it in plastic and tucked it under his seat. He didn't hear the sound behind him until it was too late. The crunch of boots on gravel, the click of a gun safety. "Step away from the truck," a voice ordered. He froze, turned slowly. 2 men in dark jackets stood near the shore, faces shadowed, one holding a pistol low. "You've been busy, Mr. Begay," the taller one said. "We'll take what you found." David's mind raced. The case was open, the reel visible. "You already have everything," he said. "Not this." "Hand it over." He glanced toward the lake. The reflection of clouds rippled over its surface, hiding the depth beneath. "You can't bury it forever," he said. The man smirked. "Watch us." Then the wind rose, throwing sand into their eyes. David lunged, grabbed the case, and ran for the water. A gunshot cracked behind him, hot pain tearing through his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He reached the shallows, flung the reel as far as he could into the lake, and dove behind a boulder. More shots echoed, but by the time they reached him, the water had swallowed the reel completely, vanishing beneath ripples of red mud. When he looked up again, the men were gone. Tire tracks led back toward the highway. The wind howled across the lake, and the cedar tree far up the ridge swayed violently, as if bowing to something unseen. Blood soaked his sleeve, but he smiled through clenched teeth. "You won't keep it hidden," he whispered. "Not again." He pressed his hand to the wound, staggered toward his truck, and started the engine. The tape might be underwater, but the world had already heard enough to start asking questions. The silence was cracking, and once it broke, it would never come back. The wound in David's shoulder refused to close. By the time he reached the highway, his vision had blurred, headlights smearing into halos. He drove one-handed, pressing a rag against the bleeding, the lake vanishing behind him like a ghost retreating into its grave. The tape was gone, but so were the men who'd tried to take it. That meant something. They hadn't expected him to fight back. They thought the story had already been buried. The heater in the truck coughed warm air that smelled faintly of rust and blood. He turned the radio on low, static, nothing else. The tribal station had gone off air entirely. No news of Inez, no mention of Marjorie, no coverage of the broadcast. The world had swallowed their voices whole. But underneath the static, he imagined he could still hear Maya's heartbeat, faint and slow, like the echo of something frozen beneath ice. It kept him awake. By dawn, he crossed into New Mexico and pulled over behind an abandoned diner. He wrapped the wound with duct tape and a torn strip of his shirt, poured whiskey over it, and bit down on his fist to keep from screaming. The pain grounded him, kept him from fading into despair. Then he opened the glove compartment and took out Maya's last letter, the one that had traveled with him through 3 decades of dust and grief. "Promise me, you'll plant that cedar." He looked out the windshield, where the faint line of mountains burned pink in the sunrise. "It's still standing," he whispered. "And so am I." He needed allies, people who couldn't be silenced with money or fear. That afternoon, he drove to Santa Fe to meet with a contact Marjorie had once mentioned. Professor Ellis Crane, a historian who'd specialized in corporate environmental crimes. The man had gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the cautious air of someone who'd made enemies before. When David showed him the documents Lena had given him, Crane's expression hardened. "This," he said, tapping the words "Operation Clearing," "is a kill order." They used this language during covert operations in the 70s. Neutralize threat meant one thing. Eliminate, can you prove it? David asked. "Proof is tricky," Crane replied. "But if you can find financial records linking these names to payments or contracts, we can start a chain of accountability. They've wiped everything. Then we find what they forgot to wipe." He directed David to an old accountant who'd once handled government subcontract budgets for Red Rock Logistics, a man living under a different name in Denver. "If anyone knows where the bodies are buried," Crane said, "it's him." The drive north took 8 hours. David's shoulder throbbed with each bump, but he refused to stop. He kept replaying the images in his head, Elijah's voice shouting over gunfire, Maya's bracelet frozen to bone, the water swallowing the reel. Every memory was fuel, every mile was vengeance. He found the accountant living in a cramped apartment above a laundromat. The name on the buzzer read J.R. Haskins, But when David introduced himself and mentioned Red Rock, the man went still. His hands shook as he locked the door behind them. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want the truth. There is no truth, only paper. And paper burns." David placed the operation clearing memo on the table. "Then tell me who signed this." Haskins studied it, then sighed. Macklin and Holbrook were company men. But there was another signature that never made it onto official documents: the funder. The mining expansion project wasn't paid out of corporate accounts. It came through a community development initiative, codename Echo Road. It looked like charity, housing, schools, clinics, but it was a slush fund for security operations. Who controlled it? Haskins hesitated. A senator from this district back then. Name was Robert Vail. He chaired the Resources Committee. He greenlit every permit those companies needed. Holbrook answered to him. David's throat went dry. "You're saying a sitting senator ordered the operation?" "Not directly," Haskins said, voice trembling. "But he signed off the funds." He knew what the word neutralize meant. He turned to a filing cabinet, rummaged through folders, and pulled out a single sheet, a scanned check stub from 1987, made out to Red Rock Logistics, signed R. Vail. "I kept this," Haskins said, "because I thought one day someone would ask." "Why not come forward?" "Because the last man who did ended up at the bottom of a mine shaft." That night, David checked into a motel outside the city. He scanned the document, backed it up on multiple servers, and for the first time felt something close to victory. The chain was there. Senator to corporation to local law enforcement to the staged crash. It was all connected, a straight line drawn in blood. He drafted an anonymous leak, attached copies of the memos, and sent it to every major newspaper, environmental watchdog, and indigenous rights group he could find. Then he waited. The first response came within hours. An email from an editor at the New York Herald. "We received your materials. Can we confirm the authenticity of these documents?" He smiled bitterly. "You'll find out soon enough," he murmured. But before he could type a reply, the motel lights flickered, then went out. He froze. The hum of the vending machine stopped. Silence swallowed everything. Outside, an engine idled. He moved to the window and peeked through the blinds. A black sedan sat in the parking lot, no headlights, just the faint glow of a cigarette ember inside. A chill ran down his spine. He grabbed his bag, slipped out the bathroom window, and crept around the back. The alley was slick with oil and rainwater. As he ducked behind a dumpster, two figures stepped out of the sedan, talking quietly into radios. They moved toward his room. He backed away slowly, his shoulder burning with every step, until he reached the end of the alley. Then he ran. He didn't stop until he hit the freeway and flagged down a passing trucker, offering cash for a ride east. The driver, an old Navajo man, looked him over and said, "You're running from bad medicine, son." "Something like that," David replied, collapsing into the seat. They drove in silence for an hour before the driver spoke again. "You know, stories like this, they always come back. You can hide them, bury them, but the earth remembers. The land keeps receipts." David smiled faintly. "That's what my brother-in-law used to say." By the time they crossed into Arizona, dawn was breaking again. The trucker dropped him at a gas station near Kayenta. He bought coffee, washed his face, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. He looked like a man pulled from another world, hollow eyes, cracked lips, blood-stained bandage. But his resolve hadn't broken. He thought of Maya's unborn child, the life that had never been born, and felt a quiet rage settle into something steady. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about names, the ones erased from reports, the ones no one had spoken aloud for decades. Later that day, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Senator Vail faces questions over 1987 mining fund. The documents he'd leaked were circulating. Journalists were sniffing. A cable channel played snippets of the tribal radio broadcast that had survived online. The story was spreading like wildfire, even as official spokesmen tried to smother it. David sat in his truck and let the tears come. Not relief, not grief, just release. The silence had cracked at last, but cracks can become chasms. 2 days later, the same news channels that had celebrated the bravery of a whistleblower began retracting their reports. Documents inconclusive. Audio possibly fabricated. A panel of experts declared the recording inconsistent with verified flight logs. The senator denied involvement, calling the leaks malicious lies. And then, just as fast as it had flared, the story vanished from the headlines. David knew what that meant. Someone had paid to erase it again. He drove back to Twin Mesa one final time. The lake was quiet under spring rain, the cedar tree bending but unbroken. He stood at its base, exhaustion flooding him. "They buried it again," he said softly, "but not forever." He closed his eyes, feeling the wind curl around him. "You told me the land remembers Elijah. So let it speak." He turned back toward the truck, unaware that someone was watching from the ridge, a silhouette against the gray sky, binoculars glinting once before vanishing behind the rocks. By the time he reached the highway, a dark shape passed overhead. A helicopter, small, fast, unmarked. He looked up at it, heart thundering, and whispered, "You can't scare me anymore." The storm rolled in again that night. Lightning cracked across the mesas, thunder shaking the valley. And somewhere deep beneath the lake, the second reel of the black box turned slowly in the current, its tape still whole, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it back to the surface. The next morning, the world looked calm again, but it was the kind of calm that comes after a predator feeds. Newspapers had already replaced Elijah and Maya's story with something cleaner, safer, a political scandal in another state, a celebrity divorce. The tribal radio tower had been stripped for maintenance, and every online trace of the recording had vanished. Even the activists who had shared the files began to receive takedown notices citing national security. It was as if someone had vacuumed the story out of existence, leaving only whispers behind. David Begay sat on the hood of his truck, parked near the edge of the canyon, staring at the sunrise bleeding across the cliffs. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His shoulder throbbed, the bandage stiff with dried blood. Somewhere below, coyotes cried, thin and haunting. He listened, eyes hollow. The world was back to pretending nothing had happened, but he knew better. The machine had just shifted gears, quieter, smarter, deadlier. He spent that day driving from town to town, meeting the few journalists still willing to talk off record. Most were afraid. One young reporter from Albuquerque said her editor had been advised to drop the topic. "They said the recordings were deep fakes," she whispered. "But my uncle worked that mine. He told me the same story 20 years ago. 2 choppers, gunfire, then silence." David nodded. "Can you go on record?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I can't." "Not yet. Then don't say you believe me. Say you believe them, the ones who vanished." By evening, the fatigue caught up with him. He pulled into an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of Tuba City and fell asleep in the cab, the desert wind howling through broken windows. In his dreams, the helicopter fell again. Blades splintering, sky on fire, Maya reaching out to him through the smoke, one hand clutching her stomach. "It's not just us," she whispered. "It's the land." Then everything turned black. He woke with a start. Rain was pounding on the roof, a rare desert storm that came without warning. For a moment, he couldn't tell where he was. The radio crackled to life suddenly, a voice half swallowed by static. "David, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone." His breath caught. It was Marjorie's voice. He stared at the radio. The transmission faded in and out, distorted, but unmistakable. "I made a backup, not at my place. In the archives north side of Gallup, the tapes labeled Audio Restoration Project. Don't trust the police. Don't trust anyone. And David," her voice broke, "don't let them bury her again." Then silence. The frequency went dead. He sat frozen, hands gripping the steering wheel, the rain hammering against the windshield like fists. The black box reel might still be at the bottom of the lake, but Marjorie, God bless her paranoia, had hidden another copy somewhere safe. And now, somehow, her voice had found its way through the static to him. He turned the key, the engine roared to life, and he drove. The storm followed him all the way to Gallup. The roads shimmered under lightning. When he reached the small local museum that housed regional archives, the parking lot was empty. The building's windows glowed faintly in the rain. He broke the side lock with a crowbar, slipping inside. The air smelled of dust and ozone. Rows of shelves stretched into the dark, stacked with boxes labeled audio. 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. He moved slowly, flashlight beam cutting across faded labels until he found it. Audio Restoration Project. Gallup Station, 1987. His hands shook as he slid the reel from its box. A small tag dangled from the side. Property of M. Klein. He found an old reel-to-reel player in the maintenance room, plugged it in, and pressed play. This time, the recording started with Elijah's calm voice, but it was a different segment than before. "If this transmission is received, I repeat, they're not responding to our radio. Object approaching from northwest, no markings. Maya says it's military. I see, then static. A metallic clang. And finally, that cold foreign voice again. This is Site Command. Execute clearance. Confirm visual on target." A pause. Elijah shouted something, a name maybe. And then the shriek of the crash cut the tape. David sank onto the floor. Tears blurred his vision. "They killed them," he whispered. "They killed her while she was carrying their child." He pressed his forehead against the machine, the hum vibrating against his skin. "I have you now," he said softly. "All of you." When he stepped outside again, dawn was breaking. The rain had stopped. Across the street, a black sedan was parked, engine running. He froze. For a long moment, neither side moved. Then the car's window rolled down, and a voice through a loudspeaker said calmly, "Mr. Begay, step away from the building." David turned and ran. Bullets sparked against the pavement as he darted into the alley, clutching the reel. He vaulted a fence, scraped his arm raw on barbed wire, and tumbled into the drainage ditch. Mud swallowed his shoes, cold and slick. The sedan's engine revved, headlights sweeping the street above. He crawled through the culvert until he reached the other side of town, lungs burning, reel still clutched